So today we're going to talk a bit about using liquid maps, or some people call liquid templates, for transformation in Azure. So my background is integration. Been doing integration now for a while. I'm a cloud platform and API evangelist for 6pivot. I'm an Azure MVP. Started out as a BizTalk MVP, then Azure integration, and then an integration MVP, now an Azure MVP. My email's there and my Blue Sky contacts are there. I've also got the contacts page, which says pretty much the same thing. But let's go on. So for the agenda today, the agenda looks pretty full, but I just want to cover as many of these things as I can. So basically, kind of what liquid maps are, what can I do with them, the text filters that we can use, building our own text filters, the liquid maps that are built into Azure Logic Apps, the liquid maps that are built into Azure API Management, the liquid maps in function, so how to use them in a function app, how to use them in a minimal API. And the minimal API also kind of covers the website side of things if you're going to use that. Then also the local dev and test, and just a quick summary at the end. So liquid maps. The interesting thing with liquid is it comes from Shopify. And what they did is they built the language originally in Ruby to be able to load dynamic content into their websites. So from a store point of view and things like that, that's what they build storefronts. And basically a lot of that theming and their content loads are all with liquid templates or liquid maps. It's been there since 2006, so it's not a new technology. But from the Microsoft perspective, it really came about with the introduction of the Logic Apps into Azure, because it was one of the transformation technologies in the Logic Apps. And also once they launched API management in Azure, the policies have the ability to use liquid template maps in there. What we're going to do today is we're actually going to look at the .NET implementation of the Shopify. So it's .liquid and it's on GitHub. So it's there. It's an open source. Both of them are open source projects. And basically, one of my big starts with the liquid maps was I work with a lot of companies to migrate their EDI. So AS2, EDIFACT, X12, those type of document exchanges, typically with the grocery stores and things like that, for purchase orders and ship notifications and things like that. All of that in the Logic Apps is based on XML documents. And I'm not sure how many developers are in the crowd there that live and breathe XML, but the number is getting smaller and smaller by the day. Most people want to do JSON. So that's one of the things that I've used the Liquid for, is to be able to transform from a JSON document into an XML document to then use the tools to create either an EDIFACT or an X12 document. So that's kind of my background experience with this. I have used it a little bit in API management, which we'll look at. So one of the things you can do is that some people may be familiar with XSLT. XSLT is a mapping kind of for XML to XML. There wasn't really anything to step into that void when we started doing JSON and things like that. What I saw was most developers would bring in both of those kind of as a class inside of their code. They would create the object and then deserialize it as a JSON object or whatever. So, but with the liquid maps, we can basically have kind of a custom .NET class, JSON or XML. With the custom .NET class, I've used the CSV helper. I'm not sure if people are familiar with it. There's a CSV helper that's out on GitHub, and it basically allows you to easily read in a CSV file into a .NET class. And then what I did is you serialize that out as JSON, and then you use the liquid map to map that. So also our destination can be XML, can be JSON, can be CSV, can be HTML. It even could be something like, I'm showing my age a little bit here. It could be the fixed position 80 column card type thing where I'm padding fields out. So I can do all of those different things with a liquid map. A very basic liquid map is here. And you'll see that we've got that content.id, content.type, content.data.api, and content.data.storagediagnostics.batch ID. So we can go, and then this is kind of just the basic using the content, but we'll see that we can do for loops. We've got some text filters, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, on basically how we iterate through that. My recent use of the liquid maps is I had a very complex XML document. Normally, I'll bring XML into an application by the xsd.exe. That allows me to create a .NET class out of an XML specification. This XML specification was so complex that xsd.exe wouldn't handle it. So basically, I stepped back and said, okay, we can't bring it in as a class. Let's do it as a liquid map. And basically, that's where I most recently used the liquid. So one of the other things that we can have is we can have text filters. And those are like, a lot of people will be familiar with the string class. You've got substring and you've got replace and things like that. And you've got append. With the dates, you have date formatting, things like that. So basically the text filters allow us to manipulate the data that we have as we're writing it out. So again, in .NET, what we'd probably do is we would either fix it up the way we wanted it in the original class, or when we do the copy between the two classes. Here, we can fix it up when we write it out. And the nice thing about that is that we might have two different maps that handle these fields two different ways. So they'll have different of these text filters. Now, a little bit of a learning curve. If you look at the Shopify text filters, they're mostly lowercase because it uses Ruby casing. In mine, I typically turn on the .NET casing, which is a Pascal casing, basically first character capitalized and underscores between if we've got multiple words. But you'll see that slice is what we think of as substring. So starting at position 0 for 5. Replace pretty much is the same as we expect. Character we want to replace and what we want to replace it with. Then our date formatting. Also, a lot of times you may need to encode strings. So you've got things like URL encoding. One of the other nice things about the way that they've implemented the .liquid is that we have some custom text filters. So one of the things I've always run into is I get data from a JSON file and I need to put it out in XML. And with things like descriptions, it's a free-form field, so you can type anything in you want to. And for a number of times, they will put XML special characters because there's like greater than, less than, ampersand, a few things like that that are special characters. So what I've done is I created a custom text filter. And what you do is we'll look at the code a little bit further along, but you register your text filter. And your text filter is as simple as a public static string, and you pass it parameters, and it does what it needs to do, and then passes back a string result. And this one here basically pads it out to however many characters that you want to pad the field to. The escape XML, which we'll look at in a minute in the code, basically goes in and just runs the escaping on it so that it takes and turns an ampersand into amp, question mark, things like that, so that it can be a valid inside of a XML document. Any questions at this point?
No, doesn't look like it.
Okay, so we're going to hop out to a demo now real quick. Let me just go in here, and I will start out with the logic, or just kind of a simple liquid map here. And that's the same one we showed. I also have, let me just go over to the other one. Let me just get there. Hold on a second. The function app one, I've got a couple of different maps. I've got a JSON to XML, which basically wraps it there. I have an XML to JSON. So looks very similar. It's just where the input data is coming from. And then I've got a JSON to CSV. And basically, there's really no special markup that I need to do. It's just those curly braces around there. And then in this one, we also use that text filter. So we get the content length, and we want to pad it with a 0 to a length of 10, so that we can basically fill a field. Sometimes some of the older systems require things padded with zeros and things like that, so we can do that. Sometimes fields require, they need to be blank padded, things like that. So basically, that's the different maps that we can have. We can then also add, let's just hop here to the, so in Liquid, this is the Shopify one. The only thing to keep in mind is the casing is different for these, but we've got all of these different filters like absolute value. We've got control flow, so we can do ifs, we can do unless, we can also do a when, we can do iterations, so we can do a for. So if we have like a header and line items, we can loop through those line items. We can break out of the loop, we can continue, we can limit the loop, whatever we need to do on that. But again, when we start looking at all of the different ones, we can do things like down case. We can do first, finding the first one in something. We can do like Liquid was a lot built around building HTML, so you can do a turn a new line character into a break in HTML. You can strip HTML, strip out the new lines. You can split a field just like you do in .NET. You can split. So all of those different things you've got in here. You got URL encode and decode. You can truncate. You can sum. All of that kind of stuff. So we basically, you can do anything you want to inside of this map. Now, there is one, so every time that percent is for your kind of your text filters. And then if we go back to the other set of text filters. Let's go into this. We can look that I've got a .NET class here that basically is text filters. So I'm wanting to, like, here's escape the file name, escape any HTML characters, escape any XML. And you can see that these custom text filters are not complex because, I mean, basically I'm using link xtext input to string, and will escape all of those characters. I can escape new lines. I have been in, this one removes any HTML tags that are inside of it. Let's see, I've got one other one in the, because I've built a few different examples. Let me just bring up the function app text filters. I added that pad one into here. So basically you can see how easy it is to build filters. Now, the filters don't work in the logic apps or in API management, but they will work in your function apps and your minimal APIs. And basically, we will see in a minute how we attach these filters to our code. But that's basically looking at some of the basic mapping pieces and some of the text filters. Let's hop back to there. So liquid maps are built into Azure Logic Apps. How many people use Logic Apps? Any show of hands?
Yeah. Two or three, Bill.
Yep. So this particular screenshot is from a Logic App standard, which basically runs in the same kind of workspace as your function apps in VS Code. And you'll see that we've got 4 different transforms here. We have transform JSON to JSON, JSON to text, XML to JSON, and XML to text. 90% of the time I use to text, because what will happen is when I'm debugging this and I'm working on my map, if it doesn't produce pure JSON, it will fail and it doesn't give you a lot of debugging. So that's why I tend to do to text, because there's no real criteria applied to text, but it's going to be, when it's right, it's going to be JSON or XML or whatever you want to. And this is the workflow inside of our Logic app. So basically it's when an HTTPS request is received, it transforms JSON to text using a map and then sends that back out. And we'll see that in the demo. I'll go through how that actually works. Now, how many people use API management?
Again, a couple.
Okay. How many people have SOAP services still in their organization?
Natalie named and another guy.
I missed that. I didn't hear you.
A couple of us.
Yeah. So one of the neat features that they've implemented in API management is a SOAP to REST feature, which means that you can point at your SOAP service with API management, and it will generate the API management policy that will expose that data as a REST endpoint and then map that to XML and a SOAP envelope and all of that in a policy, so that any new things that you build can talk to the REST endpoint. That'll convert it to the SOAP endpoint, call your SOAP service, and then I didn't include the screenshot here, but it'll actually also then transform the response back from XML to JSON and return that to the caller. And basically, you don't have to do anything except point your service at the wizard that's in API management, and it will generate all of the liquid template for you. I've had a couple of requests the opposite direction. They have got an old service that only calls SOAP, but they're building the new service, which is REST. I actually haven't done it, but it will be easy to do based on these templates. Because basically you have your template there, and you can put pretty much anything you need to in that template, and then set the context type in there and send it to the backend service however you want to. So that's one of the uses I've had for API management liquid templates and liquid maps, is that basically to do that. Being a BizTalk person, it's only been the last couple of releases of BizTalk that supported REST properly. So most of the time they were SOAP services, so I needed to do something. So that's an interesting way to approach this. And it's interesting, before API management came out, we actually did a project for a company where they had a supplier that could only speak REST. They had their backend CRM system that only spoke SOAP. So we actually put BizTalk in the middle, where now it would be just purely an API management implementation. So that's the big difference now with some of the tooling that's available. Using liquid maps in our function app. Now, why would I want to use a liquid map in a function app? Because I can bring in both classes, I can map between the classes, and I can send out the data that way. What happens when the case where the mappings change frequently? From a developer's perspective, do I want to keep opening up, creating a branch, creating a PR, creating work items to change 2 fields in a map? That's probably a little bit beyond what I'm going to be happy doing on a regular basis. So I may want to actually separate my data mapping from my code. And that's what we can do with the liquid maps. So basically, in this example here, the code shows that we're parsing a JSON string, creating a dictionary, basically using the JavaScript serializer to add that to a hash dictionary that Liquid's going to use. Then basically we load up our template into a string, we parse that template, and then we render that template. You can see this is where I'm actually registering my text filters if I'm using those. And this is where I'm setting my naming convention to be the C# naming convention. And that's pretty much, other than loading the liquid map, which I'll show you in my code, because I do a little bit different because I want to do some dev test type work with it. So I loaded a little bit different, but basically that's all the code that we would really need to put into our function app to be able to do mapping from whatever we have to whatever we want. The next one I'll show is the API, and I've taken a different one in here. Is this one is I'm sending in an XML document. So I create a new XML document, I take the XML string, I load that into my XML document, but then I go through pretty much the same thing. Create a dictionary, and then I move through that dictionary and create the dictionary, then a hash into the .liquid, and then I'll apply those same rendering to that. So basically that first example was anything that you can create into a JSON object, and this one is an XML object coming in. So I think the next thing is, let's go look at all of these. So we'll start with the Logic app. So this is the new Logic apps standard in Visual Studio Code. We've got our map deployed into our artifacts directory. Then we've got our workflow, and our workflow basically has an HTTP receive, Then it does a transform that says I'm going to take the body of the HTTP receive. I've got a choice here of a source for my map of either an integration account or locally in the Logic app. I'm just going to do it locally in the Logic app. And then a drop down here that shows me what maps are in that mapping folder in my artifacts directory. And then I'm just taking the response is basically that transformed content. So if we want to test this, we can basically, let me just close this, and then we'll do a run, start debugging. This may take a second to come up, but and see all of this stuff I can test locally, so I don't have to deploy it. Like with the consumption-based Logic apps, which was the original version of Logic apps, I would have to deploy this into Azure to test it, where now this runs with the same type of stuff as our functions do. So it basically loads up the runtime and then allows us to test locally. So it takes a second for this to come up. Any questions while I'm bringing this up?
No, I think everyone's good so far.
Okay. There's a fair bit going on in the background here because it's loading up that the functions core tool runtime and things like that in the background. Debugging the Logic apps is not as straightforward as you do with functions, but I'll show you the difference here in just a second once it comes up.
So looking at that, Bill, it looks like the Logic apps is basically a graphical wrapper around functions.
A little bit, except the underlying code that the Logic apps generate is Node.
Okay.
Just give it a second to come up. It is similar, but the code actually builds into Node.js, and the deployment is basically you just copy everything that's in this Logic apps folder. Okay, that's not good. What have we done? Yeah, let me just try to stop debugging and see if I can get it to kill that terminal off, and let me just try to run it once more. And you'll notice it's using the Azurite, the same type of emulator, storage emulator that the functions use too.
Who is using Logic apps?
Okay, so now we've got it running. We see that there's an endpoint. And then basically what we do is go up to here and we look at our workflow and we get an overview of the workflow. And that basically can show us any runs that have happened to that workflow, and it gives us the callback URL. You'll notice the callback URL's got signature and everything in it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use actually that's let me go down here to this one. Basically, I'm using the REST add-on for VS Code to call that. So basically, I'm doing a post with application JSON. So I do send request. And the authorizations obviously failed or changed. So let me go back here and copy that. Come on. And then okay, try that again and see if it works. Yep, and basically there is the XML output from that map. So this is just a really simple one. Basically, you send the JSON in, it pulls the values out of the JSON for the different ones, and then outputs the XML. So let's go now and look at the function app version of this. So basically, if we look here, we've got a pretty simple function app. So there's no real anything exceptional in the program startup. We have a JSON mapping that basically initializes some storage helpers, reads in the request body, which will be our, in this case, our JSON, and then basically initializes our liquid helper, and then basically maps our JSON, passing the configuration, the body, and the name of the map. And what we're doing is we're passing the name of the map in as a query parameter. And then it goes off to our liquid helper, and we've got a map JSON. So then it basically parses the JSON, just like I showed earlier. Then I check to see if it's running locally. If it's running locally, then I go local and grab my map. If not, I'll use a storage helper to get it out of the function app storage in Azure. So I create a container that is in the function app storage in Azure and pull that map out of there. This allows me to update those maps in that storage account outside of deploying the whole code if I want to. Then basically we do the filter. So now basically if I go here, run this, it does something very similar. So basically starts the runtime just like you would expect for running functions locally. I am running this out of Visual Studio instead of Visual Studio Code. I like the breakpoint, the breakpoints in debugging in Visual Studio a little bit more than I'm used to the ones in Visual Studio Code. So that's why I tend to use, if I'm doing functions or minimal API or anything like that, I tend to use Visual Studio. And it, again, it's the demo gods at work. It's just deciding to take longer than it should. So, but it will start here in a second. And again, what I've got in this one, I've actually got a map JSON and a map, an XML map. So you can see JSON mapping and XML mapping are my endpoints. Let's go over back to my code here, and we'll see this is going to be our JSON mapping, and I'm giving it a map, JSON to XML map. And then I just do a send request. And there's our XML coming back. Then what I can do is I can go down here, and I'm actually, this time I'm passing in the XML, and I'm doing XML mapping, and it's an XML to JSON liquid map. And then I can go in here and I can send the request. And basically it's turned that XML into JSON. I have one more in here that I've got that is JSON mapping, but it's mapping from JSON to a CSV file. So we'll go in here and then we'll send this request. And you'll see that it's basically created a CSV file. And also I've used my text filter. I've padded out that content length with zeros to make it a 10-character field. So basically that you can pretty much kind of create any type of file. One of the things I was going to play with, I just didn't have a chance, is you could actually almost create like a SQL insert. You could actually use the liquid map to create the SQL insert text based on the JSON that you had coming in if you wanted to. So you could do that to create that. I've just used a fairly simple JSON file. This is an event grid JSON file. But again, you can have multiple levels. You can have arrays. You can do for each loops through those, all of those kind of things. So if we go back to let's go back to our function app demo, and let's stop that from running. And you'll see that I've got my JSON mapping and my XML mapping. And basically it varies by what you're passing it. In this case, I'm passing it a XML string for the JSON, and I'm passing it a JSON string. If I had a class that I needed to JSON map, what I would do is use the JSON serializer in here to create the JSON string, and then I would pass that string through to my JSON mapping. So it basically would take that internal class. And the reason I say that is this is where if you were bringing in something like a CSV file and you wanted to create a JSON file out of it, you would use the CSV helper to create your .NET class inside of your code. You would use CSV helper to bring the CSV into that class. Then you would serialize that class out as JSON, and then you would use the mapper to create the particular format you wanted to do with that JSON object that you wanted to output. And one of the things that people might be interested in with this is the fact that if you've got like a SaaS product and people want reports in different formats, or they want a download in a different format, if you have your maps stored somewhere that is unique to the customer, then you can invoke that map and export that data in a different format with the same code. So you don't have to build different versions of the export tool. You don't have to build unique code for each customer. You basically just have a different liquid map that you could use to do this. Let's go now to the minimal API. So basically it looks a lot more like, come on, is not cooperating. Hold on a second. There we go. So basically this is a minimal API. If you look at the program.cs, I've got two maps, and I've got the configuration service, and that's basically my startup. My JSON mapping looks just about the same as my other one. My liquid helper is pretty much exactly. The only thing I ran into, and this will be an interesting, somebody could probably tell me this, because when I have the configuration setting is run locally, in the function app, it comes in as a lowercase true. In the minimal API, it comes through as an uppercase true. So just a little bit quirkiness. But again, I'm loading, if it's local, I'm loading it from a directory. If not, I'm loading it from a storage account. And this one basically just has my XML, the JSON to XML or XML to JSON. And we can basically start this guy up. And then I'll go back here to my, and it's this one here. So here's my JSON to XML. And that's coming from our minimal API. And then we can do the same thing in reverse with the XML. Send request. At a breakpoint. So we're definitely in the minimal API code. Add a couple of breakpoints in there, and let's just go ahead and hit continue. And there is our JSON version of the XML document that we brought in. So let me just go back into my there and hit stop debugging. Let's hop back to the slides. Any questions at this point?
I had one, Bill. What
Yep.
happens in a mapping if that data object is not there? Like you had content.id. What does it
Yep.
do if that is not in the source?
Okay, so basically, let's go in and let's go to one of our, we might as well do it in the, oh, come on. Let me just go into the function app. Let's go to our JSON to XML, and we'll just do something like, and let's start that up. Okay, let's just wait for that to start. Okay, go back to our code here. Go back up to this one, to our JSON. It just is an empty field. Now,
That's fine.
yeah, what we could do is we could implement a if statement around that. So if that field doesn't exist, it doesn't create the tags.
Okay.
So you can implement those things where you sometimes have the field and sometimes don't, and because the last thing you probably want to do is put out empty XML tags. So what you could do is in the map, you can put in like a what is it? And then actually just to make sure that we're doing the right one. Okay. Save that. Now, the only thing this will do, and I'll show you one of the little side effects of the way it works, is that if we go and run that again, send request. Oh, that's the wrong one. Hold on. Let's go to that one. You have a blank line. So what you can do is that you can do some stuff in your map. Let's go back to there. You can put some stuff around that kind of gets the dashes inside of there, get rid of some of the blanks that help you. But the thing is, it's still valid XML with white space. So it doesn't really matter whether it's got some blank lines and stuff in it. But that's basically the way you can test. You can also, like, if an item has different fields that you need to check for. You can use that if in there to help map those. So
yeah, no, that's good. The use case I've got would be building HTML email templates. We have a system that generates templates which are HTML with tokens, placement tokens, and at the moment we have our own handwritten function that basically hard codes the possible variables. This would be a lot more elegant approach to doing it.
Yeah, so yeah, it would be a lot easier because this works. I mean, the examples that you'll see out on the Liquify in there, a lot of the examples you'll see are around HTML.
Yeah.
So it works great for those email templates. Anything like that, it will do. So, because that's what the Liquid was designed for them to build their storefronts. So people could customize the storefront without having to know HTML and all of the tricks of HTML and things like that. So, and then like controlling white space and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, so this would be an ideal use of that for your HTML email templates. And then basically you just take your class that's got all the data that you want for it and hop in there. Okay, if there's, with all three of the examples that I've done, basically the logic apps, the function apps, and the minimal API all run locally and you can test locally. So that'd be the nice thing with yours is you'll be able to test those templates. You could create just an endpoint that you pass the JSON data in and your liquid map, and then it would output what that's going to look like.
Yeah.
And that makes it easier for the people that are building the maps, is they got an easy way to test without having to deploy everything to Azure or wherever they're putting it and going from there. So, and like I showed, the difference on my map comes locally when I'm running local. It comes from Azure Blob Storage when I'm running in Azure. And again, one of the advantages is that with them in Blob Storage, you can just put a new map out there or an extra map out there, and then just change the configuration of your thing to go to that different map. Any other questions?
Yeah, when you're doing multiple source files, do you have to merge them first before then doing your map?
If you were going to do multiple source files, yes, you would.
Yeah, okay. And
So,
a follow-up question, back in the day, I used to do XLT and Functoids and BizTalk a fair bit, and you could step, I know, and you could step through those XLTs reasonably well, I guess, as good as it was in the day. But is there any ability for us to step through that map, or do you have to just run it and sort of find your issues as you go?
Yeah, there's not really a way to step through it. That you would just need to run it and find out what's happening. You can look at, one of the things you can look at is that you can look at that once it creates because one of the things is you're missing fields. You don't see the fields you're expecting to see. So one of the things you might do is you can look at that, let's see, that dictionary that it creates. So you'll see a bunch of key values in that dictionary, and that'll give you an idea. And this is where that content comes from. And the reason I use the word content is because that's what they use in the logic apps and API management. So it's consistent. But you can have anything you want there, and you just use it right there. So, and then any of your layers down from there. And again, it's one of those things, like anything else, I start with a fairly simple one and I just start adding things to it. And if I break it, I go back and have a look, because the number of times that I've mistyped one of these values or one of these values and it just doesn't put anything there. So yeah, it's some of that stuff that you have to watch out for a little bit. But it's the same thing. I mean, if you're doing it in code, you get more of the IntelliSense, so it helps you a little bit. But you'll notice that it had a reasonable amount of IntelliSense when I went here and did it had a reasonable amount of IntelliSense there that it knew what I was going to do. So that makes it a little bit easier when you're doing it. So let's look at actually, any other questions?
I think we're good.
Okay, so one of the nice things we can do is we can map from just about anything to anything. So, because you can see that map file doesn't have any particular format, you can just put the content tags in there, and anything you want. Could be on a separate line, anything you want to do. And you can do HTML tags, you can do XML tags, you can do JSON, you can just do a CSV format, anything you want to do really for that. And basically, my big thing is it takes the data mapping out of the code. And I know that varies. That will be against most hardcore developers because they want to do everything in code. But from an integration point of view, a lot of times I want to try to take that mapping out of my code, because I may have lots of different documents that I need to map by just passing the data to it and the name of a map, and then I use the same piece of code. So I don't have to, and that's what I've done in a lot of my EDI implementations, is I look up the, based on the configuration information, I look up what map to apply, and I apply that particular map based on the configuration and the JSON document that came in, and apply the appropriate map. So, and that way I'm doing things in my EDI that allows me to have one actual workflow in Logic App Standard that sends all documents out for all of my different trading partners, because it's all configuration driven. So, and it's also really good if you're changing the data mapping frequently. I know this latest project, it would have been better to do some of the liquid maps on it, because I think we're up to version 14 or 15 of the mapping spec. They kept changing their mind what they wanted to do. So that would be good. The API management is a good solution too, if it's kind of if it's an inbound message that you're getting slightly different payloads from different customers, but you want to turn it into a consistent payload for your back end. So your back end doesn't have to look at the mapping. You can use because the example that I showed you with API management was for REST to SOAP, but it can be JSON to JSON. It doesn't have to be XML to JSON or JSON to XML. It can be JSON to JSON, XML to XML, anything you want to do in there. And that basically just gets deployed in API management as a policy.